What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. In this video, we will be discussing the reliability of the gospel authors and why we actually disregard them as evidence. Today we have J. Warner Wallace that's stopping by to illuminate the reasons why apologists like him take the gospel authors at their word and why they chronologically place the gospels in weird locations. So if you want to fuck around and find out exactly how wrong J. Warner Wallace is about this gospel shit, then please stay tuned.
Jim, Sam Harris questioned, how do we know that our holy books are free from error? Because the books themselves say so. In considering the accuracy of the Gospels, how important is the relationship between time and reliability?
So I want to start off right here by mentioning Alexander the Great and why the best biography that was written about him was actually written 400 years after his death by Arrian. The reason why it's considered one of the best biographies about Alexander the Great is because of the historian that wrote the biography, Arrian, and his concise use of eyewitness testimony. The reason why it's considered one of the best biographies about Alexander the Great is because of the sources that Arrian chose to use. He used first-hand eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great. And in contrast to the Gospels, Arrian has an extensive section where he discusses his sources, how he resolves contradictions in his sources, and why these sources are in fact the best sources to use. If we look to the Gospels, we don't have that. We have no discussion of the sources used for the Gospels, especially in a Gospel like Luke. Luke portrays himself to be a historian. He even kind of feigns looking into the sources, but yet he fails to name any source that he uses. So we can't tell who these sources were or what they even said. So therefore, we can't determine if the sources that Luke used were eyewitnesses at all. The most that the Gospels ever give us are scriptural references, and the sources that are used is what differentiates the Gospels from other ancient histories, because the Gospels are not historical biographies. It honestly doesn't matter that the Gospels were written 70 or even 100 years later in the case of the Gospel of John. What matters is the sources that are used to inform their texts. Whether these sources were actually close to the events or even eyewitness accounts, that matters. Could the Gospels have eyewitness accounts behind them? Sure, that's possible, but the evidence doesn't lead us in that direction. The evidence actually leads us in the direction of a dead end.
Yeah, I think if as an atheist, I was 35, I was a non-believer. And as an atheist, I think if you just said, well, I trust that this is accurate because they say they're accurate, that would not have been sufficient for me. I had to come at it a different way. And I think that's fair for us as Christians, although we trust the scriptures, to be able to make the case for non-believers who still have doubts. And so I think there's a relationship between how early is the document written to how reliable it is as an eyewitness account.
So my advice, even for Christians, is to not accept scripture as evidence. The fact that the Gospels are primarily based on the scriptures makes it more likely that the gospel authors fabricated all this information in order to correspond to the scriptures. And J-Dubs is right, the scriptures will never prove anything to a skeptic. Also, I do agree that eyewitness accounts are generally written pretty close to the time in which the events happen. Also, another thing to note is that eyewitness accounts that are written down or recalled much later in the person's life are generally corrupted, and that's just how our brains work. So the ideal situation for any historical claim is to have eyewitness accounts that were recorded pretty close to the time the event happened. But like I said though, the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, and we'll go through the reasons why they're not eyewitness accounts later on in the video, but they never cite any eyewitness sources for any of the information they supposedly provide. Just like J-Dubs agrees that the scriptures will never convince a skeptic, the Gospels based on scripture shouldn't convince us either.
This is one of the 4 characteristics of eyewitness testimony that we try to examine in every criminal trial. When an eyewitness testifies, we can ask ourselves 4 categories of questions. And one of those categories is simply, was this person really there when they say they were there? And believe it or not, there are some witnesses who want to testify to things that they didn't even see because of the fame of the moment, their interest in the case, the celebrity it might bring to them. So we have to ask that question of the gospel writers. Were they actually written? Were the Gospels written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses?
We can plainly tell that the gospel authors were not eyewitnesses to anything they supposedly report. First, they don't claim to be eyewitnesses, and they don't write like eyewitnesses. They only ever cite scripture as their source of knowledge. And this goes for whatever sources they're actually pulling from, too. Now, I don't know if Q, M, or L ever existed or not, but regardless, it seems like people only ever knew information about Jesus because of the scriptures. Second, the traditional authors that J-Dubs and other apologists like him generally think wrote the Gospels could not have written the Gospels. And this is primarily because all of the Gospels were originally written in Greek. Writing and reading in the ancient world, especially in Greek, was a completely different skill than speaking the same language. The traditional authors of the Gospels, being Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, would have been uneducated peasants in rural Judea. They just simply wouldn't have had the time nor the money in order to go to the pagan schools that would have been required for them to learn how to read and write in Greek. That little fact actually plays into Dennis MacDonald's idea that Luke based some of his gospel on the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We'll get into that a little bit later. Finally, if the Gospels were actually eyewitness accounts, then why do they contain stark contradictions between each other? And also, why do they seem to copy off of each other? While there are some minor contradictions in the Gospels that are easily explained by apologists, there are also very difficult contradictions that are simply not feasible if these are eyewitness accounts. Like, for instance, the post-resurrection appearances. Every gospel has their own version of the post-resurrection appearances, but more importantly, they also have their own unique time frames for this period as well. Our earliest gospel from Mark doesn't even have post-resurrection appearances. In fact, the post-resurrection appearances that appear now in our Bibles was actually added later in about the mid-2nd century when Christians were starting to get a little embarrassed by the fact that their earliest gospel doesn't have any post-resurrection appearances, which contradicts the other gospels that are considered canonical. And going back to when I started this last point here, why did the gospel authors have to copy off each other in order to write their accounts? If they are eyewitnesses or source their information from eyewitnesses, why do they have to verbatim copy off each other all the time? Why does the Gospel of Mark seem to take Paul's personal opinions and put them in Jesus's mouth? You see, these are the hard questions that you can't coherently answer if you adhere to the whole idea that these are eyewitness accounts.
This alone does not mean they're true. This alone does not mean that the witnesses aren't lying. But we have to ask that question, how early were they written? And I think there's a good circumstantial case that can be made. Again,
what's funny is that we don't have to make circumstantial cases for other ancient historical texts. The Gospels are unique in this fashion. Like, going back to our example of Alexander the Great and Arian, we directly have evidence of Arian discussing his sources. And other ancient historians do the exact same thing. We don't have to guess, like, where these historians were getting their information from. They directly fucking tell you. This is one of the most basic ways that the Gospels differ from actual historical biographies. Another thing is that the Gospels were written anonymously, so there's no way for us to know who wrote them so that we can determine whether or not they knew eyewitnesses or had access to eyewitness testimony. The titles of the Gospels were affixed to them after they were written, when these Christian communities were having trouble differentiating between the different Gospels of Jesus. We don't have to do this for any other historical source like J-Dubs is trying to do. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't anonymous texts written, even histories, but we're not sitting here painstakingly trying to piece things together in order to tell us if they were using eyewitness accounts or not. Ancient historians used an eyewitness account, then they discussed the eyewitness account that they used. That was just normal ancient historian practice. So no, these are not eyewitness accounts. We can't discern historical fact from fiction in these narratives, so therefore we can't use them for historical information.
Don't want to say that, remember, circumstantial evidence is very powerful in a courtroom. This is not to be denigrated, oh, it's just circumstantial. No, every case I've worked as a cold case detective has been entirely circumstantial. And we can make good cases that are clear for jurors.
Sure, we can use circumstantial evidence in order to establish some things about the Bible. Like the evidence that the author of Luke Acts based part of his narrative on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey that Dennis MacDonald has shown. True, it's circumstantial evidence, but it is supported by the fact that whoever authored Luke would have had to attend these pagan schools that would have taught their students to copy work like the Iliad and the Odyssey in order to create new narratives. That's actually how these pagan schools taught how to read and write in Greek. So while MacDonald's evidence may be circumstantial, it is supported by direct evidence. And that's how Dennis MacDonald's argument differs from the argument that J-Dubs is trying to make. You see, they have circumstantial evidence that contradicts the direct evidence that we have. Direct evidence like anonymous authorship, scriptural citation, and the lack of real source citation.
Let me give you a quick, brief circumstantial case for early dating. You'll notice that in no New Testament account is there any mention of the destruction of the temple. It's missing from every New Testament document, even though in Matthew 23, Jesus predicts the destruction. Wouldn't it be great to mention its fulfillment? It's missing. The siege of Jerusalem is also missing 2 or 3 years prior to the destruction of the temple. 1 Peter would have been a great place to mention the suffering that Christians endured during this time of the siege, but none of it's mentioned anywhere.
You know, I'm not really sure why he jumps to Matthew 23 when Mark 13 predates that passage. Oh, right! He speculatively thinks that Matthew precedes Mark. Well, there at least isn't really a coherent case to be made for that position. The argument that J-Dubs is trying to make is that Jesus really prophesied the temple's destruction. There are more plausible explanations than magical psychic powers. The most obvious explanation being that these gospel accounts were written after the temple's destruction, and so they reworked this particular event into the gospels by having Jesus prophesy it. Another way that they could have done this is by just reading the socio-political climate of that area and realizing that the temple's days were numbered, and so they worked that into their narrative, basically taking a long shot and that the temple would be destroyed, and it panned out. Both of these possibilities are more plausible and probable than psychic powers.
As a matter of fact, the three most important characters in the book of Acts, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul, are all alive at the end of the book of Acts. Paul's in custody. There's no mention of Peter's death, no mention of James. Now, remember, the writer Luke is going to write about the death of Stephen, the death of James, the brother of John. Why omit the deaths of all the three primary players? And we know James, for example, history puts his death right around 61 AD.
Well, first of all, Acts is most certainly historical fiction. So using that as a historical source is just not going to work out well for you. Even if there was historical information in it, how would you go about discerning historical fact from fiction in the narrative? Currently, there's no mutually agreed upon methodology for doing this. Since we can't determine historical fact from fiction in Acts, that makes Acts evidentially useless to us. The apologist solution to this is to take it all as historically accurate, which isn't supported by the evidence, by the way. But finally, Acts doesn't reference James as the brother of Jesus. It definitely does mention two different James, and one of those Jameses is the apostle known as James, son of Zebedee, but we're not given any kind of context as far as this other James. He's definitely not referenced as the brother of Jesus. This is an assumption that is made. And it's a little odd for J-Dubs to do this. Oh wait, no it's not. Apologists like J-Dubs do it all the time.
Well, I think that all of these things are missing because of the fact that they hadn't happened yet. That's the one explanation that would account for all the absences of those 5 elements. And so it's a good inference from the evidence.
But that's not the only explanation for the evidence. He's definitely weaving a narrative that only his explanation is parsimonious with the evidence that we have. Obviously, that's false. What kind of fucking detective formulates what answer he wants to be true first and then ignores all other explanations for the evidence? All it does is make it seem like this is the explanation J-Dubs wants to be true, and so he's only explored that particular explanation. It kind of seems like a shit detective move if you ask me.
In addition to that, I think there are a couple of places in 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians where Paul seems to either be referencing directly scripture from Luke or concepts that Luke is also talking about in his scripture. There's good reason to believe, I think, that Paul is familiar with Luke's writings.
First of all, 1 Timothy was authored by a completely different person than Paul. It's one of those pastoral epistles that were all definitely written by one person, but it wasn't Paul. And the other pastoral epistles are 2 Timothy and Titus. Dr. Bart Ehrman has done significant research on these texts, and he's the one that has determined that they're all written by the same person, and that person was not Paul. And this is a consensus opinion based on solid evidence. So this is more easily explained by Luke copying from Paul's epistles or some other way that he got the information, but it ultimately comes from Paul. There's actually more solid evidence to place Luke after 93 CE due to his use of Josephus. Paul died around 64 to 65 CE, so that makes it impossible for Paul to have known Luke's gospel. What J-Dubs does is he starts with the assumption that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, so that must mean that Paul knew what Luke wrote. This is called an ad hoc assumption. Because J-Dubs, or rather the apologists that inform J-Dubs, they don't have direct evidence that whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke was Paul's traveling companion. You know, this is really piss-poor detective work.
And remember, the book of Acts, if we did it before 61, the death of James, we've got to put the gospel right in front of that, because he says he writes the gospel first. And we've got Paul referencing the gospel as early as 53 to 57 in 1 Corinthians. How early is this now?
This is such revisionist bullshit. Acts could not have been written before Josephus wrote Antiquities in 93 CE. This is due to a lot of evidence that makes it nearly indisputable. Common mentions by both Luke and Josephus are the census under Quirinius, the same 3 rebel leaders mentioned in the same order, the death of Agrippa I as God's vengeance, the association of Agrippa II with Bernice, the association of Felix with Drusilla. The parable of the hated king sounds an awful lot like Josephus on Herod. The similarities in the description of the siege of Jerusalem, mentioning a famine in the reign of Claudius, and Pilate's attack on Galileans sounds like Pilate's attack on Samaritans at Gerizim. So, there's no way that J-Dubs' timeline can make any kind of sense with the evidence that we have.
Because remember, Luke is going to reference more than anyone else the Gospel of Mark. He says he's interviewing eyewitnesses, and he says he's going to make an orderly account for Theophilus.
Well, we know that Luke used Mark's Gospel because of textual clues in his Gospel, not because he directly referenced him. We also have no fucking clue who Theophilus was. He's literally not found elsewhere in history. Of course, this doesn't surprise me coming from a cold case detective who investigates only one explanation that just so happens to coincide with his predetermined conclusion.
Why would he say an orderly account? Well, Papias said that Mark's account, although accurate, was not orderly. It almost appears that Luke is referencing Mark, and so I think it's reasonable. The reasonable inference is to place Mark in front of Luke. And as I kind of work through the circumstantial case, I think we've got accounts that begin to appear in the late 40s, early 50s, and that means they're appearing early enough in history to have been written by eyewitnesses. That alone is not going to say that they're reliable yet. It's just one aspect of reliability.
Okay, well, what we actually have evidence for is Paul starting to write about 55 CE. And then Mark is written using the Pauline epistles. Well, next we have Matthew copying almost all of Mark, and then Luke comes in and he uses Matthew, Mark, Josephus, and Homer to write his narrative. J-Dub's timeline is all messed up, but he has to do this in order to make the Gospels work for the narrative he wants to tell. That narrative requires rewriting history that nobody should take as historical fact. Well, heathens, that's it for this video today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about J-Dubs' video. What'd you think about my analysis of it? Do you think I missed something? Who knows? Let me know down below in the comment section. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.